Greetings, ICT Nigeria. I wanted to briefly address the topic of technological unemployment. By the way, I'm James Hughes, Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and I'm speaking to you from Boston. And I hope you have a good conference. I'm a sociologist, and I've been working for many years on technology ethics issues. And in recent years, one of the issues that we've become increasingly focused on is the issue of technological unemployment, the idea that technology may begin to destroy more jobs than it creates. And this is a very old idea in the West, that this would eventually happen. It goes back at least 200 years. And has been predicted many times and has never actually occurred. When labor began to be displaced in agriculture, it moved into factories, and it was difficult to imagine the growth of the different kinds of factory jobs and then service industry jobs and ancillary kinds of occupations in cities. But those did grow. And then when different kinds of industrial work began to be displaced by automation, it was difficult to imagine the expansion of white-collar employment and government services and so forth that expanded in the 20th century, and but yet those kinds of occupations grew. The question is whether this time is different and whether technology is beginning to grow and change at such an accelerating pace that there will not be time for employment and the labor market to adapt. Now, most of this discussion has been focused on the economies of the OECD or the North, and the concern has been growing, especially since the last 6 years. Some economists at MIT, some economists at Harvard had begun to make the case, which was still a very unpopular case, given the historical record, that technological unemployment would eventually occur. And the economists at Oxford, who made this case, argued that about half of all employment in Europe and the United States would eventually, within the next 20 or 30 years, would become obsolete. And it's very difficult to imagine workers being able to transition that quickly into new employment. Then we began to have the pickup and pace of development of self-driving cars. Enormous amount of workers are employed by truck driving and taxi driving and so forth, and Uber and those kinds of phenomenon began to displace workers in various ways. And so now the case has become much more compelling, and also it's true in general that although Washington, D.C. or the economics profession has generally not yet been convinced about technological unemployment, that is almost a consensus that it will occur in Silicon Valley, that the people who are watching and creating the technological innovations that will probably displace labor in the future in Silicon Valley are very convinced that this is going to be an imminent problem. And we just saw yesterday here in the United States, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, arguing for a universal basic income at Harvard. He gave the Harvard commencement address, and he argued that it was desirable and inevitable that we would have a universal basic income. That is, that if we transition to a society, an economy in which there's less and less work, that eventually we will have to take money from the industries and corporations and the people with wealth who continue to make money in that kind of an economy and redistribute it to everyone else, just to keep everyone fed and to keep the economy continuing to turn over. So that universal basic income idea has also been around for at least 200 years. And now the two ideas are closely combined in a set of arguments for what some in Britain, for instance, call post-capitalism, and which has been this idea that's long been in the left, in the Western left, a marginal idea, because the Western left, mostly since Marx, has adopted the idea that work in itself is a good, that creating maximum or total employment in a society, even if it requires the expansion of the state to employ people, is the goal rather than to eliminate work. And especially in developing societies, Africa, Asia, it has never been a terribly popular idea to have a society in which there is less and less work. The goal has been generally for people of all political persuasions to create a full employment society. And that's true, as I said, still in the public policy circles in the United States and in Europe. Very few parties or policy analysts are yet willing to embrace a post-capitalist, post-work future because they don't think that it's desirable on the one hand, and they don't think that it's inevitable on the other. So we in the IET generally think that a post-work society and depending on how you define it, a post-capitalist society is desirable, and we have been trying to make that case. Now, one of the things that, just to expand just for a second on the case itself, there are some important set of caveats. One is that there's not very much evidence yet that by traditional measures, productivity has been increasing at a rate, and certainly not at an accelerating rate, and may, by some measures, not even be increasing at all in the OECD economies. And if that's the case, it's harder to make the case for technological unemployment. One would expect that if we are racing towards a future of technological unemployment, that each worker in a factory would their productivity would increase year by year because the tools that they were working with would become more and more, would produce more and more. And so the productivity argument is, I think, one of the complicating factors in convincing at least economists and public policy people. On the other hand, there is substantial belief in the American populace and a growing belief in the European populace. Public polls show that many people believe that jobs will be displaced, but they rarely believe that their job can be displaced. There's a lot of doublethink about this. And we find in the United States that the support for our fascist president, Trump, was very closely tied to being in an area in which there was technological unemployment. As we think especially of what we call the Rust Belt around the Great Lakes in the northern part of the United States, Michigan and Ohio, those kinds of places. The communities in which technological unemployment through automation in factories displaced many workers and contributed to the rising rates of suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, so forth in the economically displaced communities in the United States. Those are the communities that also turned from supporting President Obama to voting for Trump. And so there is a substantial now local, regional, sectoral evidence for technological unemployment. Yet, very little discussion of it at the policy level. There are some exceptions. There's, for instance, in the French elections, it became a bit of a debate because the French Socialist Party candidate was addressing this topic, and basic income has begun to become a popular topic in some European discussions, but not yet in the United States. Another thing to say about technological unemployment is that it's not just related to robots and to factory automation, but it's also related to what's called disintermediation. So An example of that is it's probably going to be a long time before the college professor, the university professor, can be completely displaced by a robot. That's difficult to imagine the philosophy robot that would become a better philosophy teacher than the philosophy professor. However, the internet makes it possible for philosophy professors who are well recognized around the world to reach many more people than they could before. So this is what's called disintermediation, that and the extended reach through the internet. So for instance, if you want to make a plane reservation, in the past, one would have gone to here, one would have gone to the travel agent, and the travel agent would have made your plane reservation. Now you don't have to do that. You can go directly to a company through Expedia or whatever, and all the humans who were the intermediaries for you there have disappeared because you can make your plane reservations directly. Now, in that case, a human being has been eliminated. That's disintermediation. There's also the extended reach. In the case of the philosophy professor, there's the extended reach that occurs through the internet economy, so that fewer and fewer people can serve more and more. And that displaces human beings as well. There's still a human doing it, but fewer and fewer humans have to do it. One philosophy professor can teach 100,000. Perhaps not as well, that remains to be seen. And so we have to do more research on distance learning and so forth. There's also a substantial growing agreement, I would say, about the impacts of technology on inequality in the United States and in the West. That here we have a growing economic dislocation between the 1%, the 0.1% of the population who are getting all the benefits of accelerating technological innovation. But most of the jobs that are impacted, the sectors that have been impacted so far, are those that are easier to automate. And at the top of the labor market, where the best paid jobs are the ones that require long educations and are therefore the most difficult, the most cognitively complex generally, and more difficult to automate. At the bottom of the labor market, you have many jobs that require physical dexterity, such as being a nurse, or being a construction worker requires many different kinds of physical activities, all of which are very difficult for robots to do. Industrial robots are relatively easy. An assembly line's passing, they have to do something on an assembly line, you can design the robot to do that. It's very difficult to design a robot to navigate a house, and clean a house, or to navigate a construction site and do all the things that need to be done there. So we see that the middle of the income sector, the jobs that are the most vulnerable to automation, are in fact the jobs that have been disappearing over the last 20 years. And so that's been contributing to a growing economic inequality and the shrinking of the American middle class, and those people often finding it very difficult to find new employment. If they lose their job as a factory worker at 50, it's very difficult to be retrained as a solar panel installer or home health nurse or whatever people think they might be able to do. So that part of it, the argument, the growing inequality, has become increasingly compelling for economists and public policy people. But depending on your politics, if you're on the left, you think, well, the solution to that inequality is just redistribution and job training and expansion of higher education and so forth. Of course, if you're on the right, you think it's to cut taxes and unleash the creativity of the capitalist class by cutting their taxes in particular and allowing them to then create jobs and so forth. So not very many people have been focusing on this as a prelude to more widespread technological unemployment. Now, the reason I wanted to make this a particularly African or developing world case is that very little attention has been given so far to the ways in which this will impact the developing world. And as you know, the kind of sustainable, or the sustainable or not, the development model that has been in place for many decades has been that as the economies of the North and South develop, certain kinds of employment, because the wages are cheaper in the developing world, that certain kinds of employment will shift from the North to the South, what we would call here outsourcing, and what people in the developing world would call investment, foreign investment, or just the growth of domestic industries that displace the industries in the North as the North begins to do other kinds of things. And that has been happening in many different ways. But China, for instance, is beginning to confront that they are not able to compete against even cheaper places, Bangladesh or other places in the world, as their workers become more middle class. And so they've begun to see that within, for instance, Chinese industries, that it is becoming compelling for them to institute automation of different kinds of jobs in order to displace their human workers and create cheaper products that they can sell abroad. And so in the developing world, we're also seeing the pressure to displace cheaper human labor with even cheaper automation, and create economic benefits that could be shared, again, hopefully more equitably, in those countries, but not necessarily create jobs in those countries. So this is going to be a profound challenge to the economic model. The other thing that's happening in the North is that rather than setting up an international production network where that requires the production of something by cheap hands in the developing world that have to be then transported to the North to be consumed or used, it has begun to be seen that it's cheaper, in fact, to set up robotic production in the North, or 3D printing in the North, these different kinds of industries, and simply move it around within the North or within the country that it's produced in. And so there has been a slowdown of outsourcing of jobs and industries from the North to the South, with the exception of some things that can be done through the internet, like the growth of Indian call centers, as an example, and other countries' call centers, is an example of the fact that it's still cheaper to hire a person in India to answer questions for Microsoft or Apple than it is to hire an American to do that. But in those kinds of cases, answering robots or answering software, artificial intelligence, is quickly becoming sophisticated enough that it might be the case very soon that those call centers won't be needed either, because the robots will be sufficiently sophisticated to answer and direct people for most purposes when they call one of them. And so at any rate, this is a huge problem that will have to be addressed in development economics in the North and the South, because the economic aspirations of many in the developing world depend on that growth of employment. And if employment growth begins to slow for these reasons in the South as well as in the North, then we're going to have to radically rethink what it means to become a prosperous country, and become an equal world. At any rate, there are experiments in the South with universal basic income, and they have been generally very successful in South Africa and other places. And I think that is part of the solution in the South as well as part of the solution in the North. And it may be that there are ways in which the technologies, the technological innovations that are coming out of this growth of artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and so forth will create leapfrog opportunities for Africa, as with, for instance, cell phone technology in Africa has leapfrogged their applications in the north, because in the north we still had all these investments in landline telephones, but in Africa, in many places, it was cheaper to begin to do things like banking through cell phones as opposed to the traditional banking methods that we were using. And it may be that those kinds of technological innovations in Africa will provide opportunities for adapting to a slowing employment or negative employment future that we can't quite imagine yet. But that's basically the set of issues that I have been thinking about, and that I think people in development economics for the South need to begin thinking about. And I hope you have a good conference. And if you have any questions, you can contact me at ieet.org and visit my website at ieet.org. And I've been Jay Hughes. Thanks so much for taking the time, and I hope you have a good conference today. Bye.